the sight of her dolls. Her room was filled with them. Some were perched on shelves, others scattered across her dresser, and a few on her bed. She had always loved them, keeping each one carefully placed and arranged before going to sleep. But recently, something strange had been happening. When she woke up, they were never where she had left them the night before. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, or perhaps the restless shuffle of sleep that made her forget where she'd placed them, but it happened too frequently to ignore. One morning she woke to find her favorite porcelain doll, with its cracked smile and yellowing dress, standing upright on her bedside table when she was sure she'd put it on the shelf. Another time, a stuffed bear, its fur threadbare from years of hugging, was found sitting in the center of her room, its black button eyes fixed directly on her bed, though she was certain it had been tossed carelessly on the chair the night before. It was unnerving, but Emily told herself she was probably just being silly. After all, dolls were inanimate objects, right? They couldn't move on their own. She even started to laugh it off, imagining that maybe her parents or her older brother Daniel were playing tricks on her. But there was always something unsettling about the way they were arranged. Each time she found them moved, it was as though they were watching her, positioned just slightly off from how they had been the day before. Then, on a particularly stormy night, Emily decided she had had enough. She needed to understand what was happening. As the wind howled outside her window and the rain battered against the glass, Emily lay in bed, staring at her collection of dolls. They were scattered about, some lying in disarray, while others stood perfectly still, almost as though they were waiting. Emily's room was dimly lit by the flickering light of a bedside lamp, and the shadows cast by the dolls seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. She tried to ignore the unease creeping up her spine, telling herself it was just the storm, but her eyes kept darting back to the dolls. The way their glassy eyes seemed to reflect the dim light unnerved her. It wasn't just that they were out of place. It was the way they seemed to change their positions from one morning to the next. The porcelain heads were always turned in new directions, as though they were observing something she couldn't see. Emily closed her eyes, pushing away the feeling of dread building in her chest. She counted the seconds, trying to calm her nerves. But then, just as she was about to drift off to sleep, she heard a faint sound. A soft scrape. It was so subtle that she almost thought it was just the wind, or maybe her imagination running wild. But then she heard it again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. A slight shuffle. Her eyes flew open. The dolls, scattered across the room, appeared the same as before. But in the dead silence of the room, Emily was sure she had heard something. Her heart pounded in her chest as she listened intently. She strained her ears, trying to determine the source of the sound. There it was again. Another scrape, followed by a soft thud. Emily turned her head slowly, her gaze falling on the corner of the room where a small, ragged doll sat on a low shelf. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched the doll's tiny head tilt slightly, as if it had just moved on its own. A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and tried to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe she was just too tired. The storm outside was raging, and the wind made the trees scratch against the windows. But then, as she looked closer, the doll's head tilted even further, and her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't her imagination. The doll had moved. Panic surged through her. Emily's breathing quickened and her chest tightened as she stared at the dolls scattered around the room. One by one, she saw them shift ever so slightly. Just a small movement, but enough to send a wave of fear through her. The glass eyes of a tiny doll at the foot of her bed turned, locking onto her with an unsettling intensity. The stuffed bear shifted, its head tilting upward, as if following her every movement. She wanted to scream. She wanted to jump out of bed and run from the room, but her body felt frozen. She could hardly breathe, let alone move. The dolls kept shifting, their stiff joints creaking, as if they were stretching after a long sleep. The porcelain faces, the soft fabric bodies, all of them were coming alive, slowly, deliberately. And then Emily saw it. A small wooden doll, one she had completely forgotten about, sitting on the windowsill, turned its head completely toward her. Its eyes, small beads of black, gleamed in the dim light. Emily's breath hitched as the doll's mouth opened slightly, revealing a sliver of cracked, chipped wood. The room was suffocating with the heavy silence, broken only by the soft creaks and scratches of the dolls. Emily could feel the weight of their presence, like 1,000 unseen eyes boring into her. Her body trembled, but still, she didn't dare move. The scrape of porcelain against wood broke the silence again. This time, the sound was followed by another, then another. Emily's gaze snapped to the center of the room, where a larger doll, an old-fashioned one in a tattered dress, slowly moved. Its head turned as it seemed to shift toward the others, its stiff limbs jerking with the movement. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she slowly began to realize the truth. The dolls weren't moving on their own. No, they were coming to life. And they weren't just moving. They were watching her. She felt it, every single one of them, their cold, lifeless eyes locked onto her. With a final bone-chilling creak, the dolls stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence once again. Emily, now paralyzed with terror, dared not move. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, the only sound in the otherwise dead quiet room. She stayed perfectly still, waiting for the inevitable. Then, just as the storm outside howled louder, the door to her room creaked open. It wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, had opened the door. Emily's eyes flicked to the doorway. She couldn't see anything, but she knew deep down that there was something standing just beyond the threshold. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the dolls weren't the only ones in her room anymore. The next morning, Emily woke to the usual feeling of dread. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The storm had passed, but the silence was deafening. As she opened her eyes, she saw it. Her dolls were no longer scattered across the room. They had formed a perfect circle around her bed. In the center of the circle was the largest doll, the one with the tattered dress, its cracked porcelain face staring directly at her. Every other doll, small and large, stood in an eerie, perfect formation, their glass eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. Emily's heart raced, her chest tightening with fear. She didn't move, unable to tear her eyes away from the circle of dolls that surrounded her. It felt like they were closing in on her, their silent stares boring into her soul. The weight of their gaze was overwhelming, pressing down on her chest like a vice. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. She couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't run. The dolls were watching her, waiting for something, waiting for her to make the first move. Then, as the silence stretched on, the smallest doll, the one from the windowsill, slowly raised its arm, and Emily realized with chilling certainty that it was too late. The dolls weren't just watching her anymore. They were waiting for her to join them. The next few days after the dolls' unsettling behavior seemed to drag on in a haze. Emily couldn't shake the image of them arranged in that circle around her bed. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get the scene out of her mind. It was as if something inside her had snapped, some fragile thread of sanity that kept her grounded in the ordinary world. Now, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind outside, sent her into a panic. The dolls seemed to linger in her thoughts, even when she wasn't looking at them. When she did look at them, however, it was as though they were alive, watching her every move. At night, the shifting and scraping sounds had stopped, but Emily couldn't help but feel that they were still watching, silently waiting. She never told anyone about it. Not her parents, not Daniel, who spent most of his time lost in his own world, or her best friend, Kate. What could she say? How could she explain that the dolls, her beloved childhood companions, had somehow turned into something dark and malicious? No one would believe her. And yet, every night, she found herself peering at the dolls before closing her eyes, hoping against hope that they were simply ordinary toys, that she was imagining things. But deep down, Emily knew the truth. She knew the dolls had changed, were changing still. The longer she stayed in her room, the more it seemed as if the air itself was thickening, growing heavier with each passing moment. One evening as dusk fell and the last light of the day disappeared, Emily sat in the corner of her room, her legs tucked beneath her. She was too tired to do much else, too tired to think straight. The storm clouds from a few days ago had been replaced with a thick, oppressive fog that clung to the windows, making the room feel even more suffocating than before. She stared at the dolls, which were arranged on their shelves on her dresser across the floor, some still, some in odd postures that gave them an eerie life of their own. Emily tried to focus on something else, but her eyes kept drifting back to them. Her fingers twisted anxiously around the hem of her sweater, but she still couldn't look away. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat filling the room with a growing sense of dread. She had to know if the dolls were really moving on their own, or if it was just her imagination. Maybe it was time to catch them in the act. Emily had never been particularly brave. She was the kind of girl who preferred the safety of stories over real-life horror. But something about the dolls, their eerie stillness, their glassy eyes, pulled her into their web. She wanted answers, even if the truth was more terrifying than she could possibly understand. She had to know. It was late when she finally made her decision. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting pale beams of light across the room, illuminating the dolls one by one. Emily stayed still, her breath slow and steady, trying to calm the frantic thoughts running through her mind. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to shield herself from the icy feeling creeping along her spine. Slowly, as quietly as she could, she pushed back the covers and slid out of bed. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and she froze, her body tense as if she'd just committed some terrible crime. The room was still. The dolls were motionless, but she didn't believe it. She knew better. Slowly, she crept toward the dolls, trying to keep her footsteps as silent as possible. Each doll seemed to be staring at her, their glass eyes locked on her every movement. There was something wrong about the way they were arranged, something off-kilter. Some of them faced one another, others looked in odd directions, their heads cocked as though listening to something only they could hear. Emily felt the cold air around her growing denser as she moved closer. her breath shallow as she tried to steady herself. She stopped at the edge of the room, just inches away from the first row of dolls. Her eyes flickered over each one. Her heart beat faster as she slowly crouched down to get a closer look. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but the dolls looked as still as ever. For a moment, she felt almost foolish. Maybe she had been imagining it all. Maybe there was nothing wrong with them at all. Then, just as she started to breathe again, she heard it. A small, barely audible scrape, like the sound of something shifting on the floor. It was so soft at first that she thought it was just the wind or the house settling. But it came again, this time louder, more distinct. Emily's breath hitched, and she slowly turned her head toward the source of the sound. One of the dolls, a small, frilly one with a pink bonnet, had moved. Emily could hardly believe her eyes. The doll's porcelain leg had shifted, now pointing slightly outward, as though it had just taken a step. Her heart stopped, and the cold dread that had been building inside her suddenly exploded. She froze, staring at the doll, barely able to comprehend what she was seeing. The scrape came again, and this time, Emily saw it clearly. The doll's head, which had been facing away from her, slowly turned, its glass eyes fixing on her, unblinking and unyielding. The hair on the back of Emily's neck stood up, and her entire body went rigid. She could feel the weight of their gaze on her, cold and unrelenting. The other dolls, too, seemed to shift ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly, but there was no mistaking it. They were moving. Panic surged through Emily's chest, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed, as if something invisible were holding her in place. The dolls were coming alive, no longer just shifting, but slowly, deliberately, coming to life right before her eyes. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the only thing she could think of was how to escape. Then, just as quickly as it started, the movement stopped. Emily's breath came in short, shallow bursts as she stood there in the suffocating silence, her heart pounding wildly. She dared not blink, afraid that if she looked away for even a second, the dolls would be even closer, closing in on her. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the ragged rhythm of her own breath. She stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the dolls. They seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for her to make the first move. And then it happened. The largest doll, the one with the tattered dress, moved. Slowly, its stiff limbs creaking, it shifted forward, its feet dragging across the floor with a soft scrape. Emily's eyes widened in horror as the doll's face turned toward her, its empty eyes boring into her. It didn't just stare. It seemed to be looking right through her, as if it saw something beyond her, something dark and terrifying. The doll's arm lifted, its hand outstretched as though beckoning her closer. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she backed away, her body moving of its own accord. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of the room, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She was rooted to the spot, as if some invisible force was holding her captive. The dolls had stopped moving, at least for now, but their eyes never left her, never blinked, never wavered. She glanced at the door, knowing it was her only escape. But before she could move, the room seemed to grow darker, the air thicker, as though the very walls were closing in on her. The dolls, now perfectly still again, surrounded her. They were closing in, their eyes fixed on her, their mouths silent. But she could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. For a moment, Emily thought she was going to faint. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The room felt too small, too cramped, as if the walls were pressing in, leaving no room for escape. Every inch of her body screamed at her to move, but it felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, unable to break free. And then, just as her mind began to shatter under the pressure, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. It was her mother. Emily's heart leapt in her chest as the door to her room creaked open. Her mother's voice, calm and soothing, called to her from the doorway. "Emily, are you okay?" Emily's eyes snapped toward the door, her breath hitching with a mix of relief and terror. But when she turned back toward the dolls, they were gone. The room was as it had always been, silent, still, and empty. The dolls were no longer arranged in a circle. They were all back in their usual places, perfectly still and lifeless. Her mother stepped inside the room, her expression warm, unaware of the terror that had just unfolded. She walked over to Emily, gently placing the hand on her shoulder. "What's the matter, sweetheart? You look like you've seen a ghost." Emily couldn't speak. Her mouth was dry, her thoughts a blur. She shook her head, unable to find the words. She couldn't explain it. She couldn't explain the dolls. She couldn't explain the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded. The horror that had taken hold of her seemed too much to understand, too much to share. Her mother smiled kindly and kissed her forehead. "It's okay, darling. You just had a bad." The days after that night were a blur for Emily. She didn't know how to explain what had happened, or if it had even happened at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the dolls, those lifeless faces staring back at her, their silent, judging eyes. The memory of the circle they had formed around her bed was burned into her mind, and the feeling of their cold presence never fully left her. She tried to convince herself that it had all been a nightmare, just a figment of her imagination, playing tricks on her in the dark. But deep down, she knew the truth. The dolls were real. The fear, the tension, they were real. Days turned into weeks, and though the dolls never moved again, Emily could feel the shift in her own mind. She didn't play with them anymore. She didn't even look at them, except when absolutely necessary. They were simply objects now, empty and lifeless. But they still held a sinister presence in the corner of her room, like a dark shadow that wouldn't let go. Her mother noticed her change in behavior. Emily had always been a cheerful, curious child, but now she seemed withdrawn. She no longer smiled as easily, and there was a far-off look in her eyes that her mother couldn't quite place. She tried to talk to her, tried to understand what was wrong, but Emily refused to say anything. She didn't want to speak of the dolls, couldn't speak of them, not when they still haunted her thoughts. One afternoon, as Emily sat in the living room, staring blankly at the television, her brother Daniel entered. He was the same as always, carefree, laughing at jokes, completely oblivious to the strange things that had been happening in the house. But that day, something was different about him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with an expression Emily had never seen before. "Emily," Daniel said, his voice low and hesitant, "there's something I need to show you." Emily looked at him, her heart racing. "What is it?" Daniel didn't answer at first. He just stared at her, as if he were trying to decide how to say it. His hands twitched at his sides, almost nervously. After a long pause, he spoke again. "You need to see the attic." Emily frowned. "The attic?" "Yeah," Daniel replied. I found something there. Something you need to see." At the mention of the attic, Emily's blood ran cold. She hadn't been up there in years. The attic was a dark, forgotten space, filled with boxes of old clothes, furniture that no one used anymore, and dust-covered relics from the past. It was the kind of place that gave her the chills, a place she avoided at all costs. But now, her brother was asking her to go there. She felt a knot form in her stomach as she stood up. Why? I don't know, Daniel said, his voice trembling. But you have to see it. You have to understand. Reluctantly, Emily followed her brother up the narrow stairs to the attic. As they reached the top, the air grew thick with the smell of old wood and mildew. The attic door creaked open with an unsettling groan, and Emily stepped inside, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that filtered through the small window at the far end, and the silence felt heavy, like the weight of years pressing down on her. Daniel led her to a corner of the attic, where a large, covered object sat beneath a faded sheet. His hands shook as he pulled the cloth away, revealing a large wooden chest. "What is this?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't answer. He simply lifted the lid of the chest, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. Inside were dozens of dolls. They were not like the ones in her room. These were old, their faces cracked and faded with age. Some had missing limbs. Others had glassy eyes that stared back at her in the dim light. They were arranged in a circle, just like the ones in her room. Emily's heart began to pound in her chest as she backed away, her mind racing. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no." Daniel stood beside her, his eyes wide with terror. I don't know where they came from. I just found them in the chest and I don't know what to make of it." Emily's legs trembled beneath her as she backed away from the chest, her heart racing. She couldn't breathe. The dolls they were all the same as the ones in her room, the same as the ones that had moved, the ones that had surrounded her, the same as the ones that had watched her. And now, they were here. "Daniel," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to get rid of them. We need to burn them. Now." Daniel looked at her, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What are you talking about? These are just dolls, Emily. They're old. They don't mean anything." "You don't understand," Emily said, her voice shaking. They're not just dolls. They're alive. They watch. They move. They want something." Daniel frowned, clearly unsure of what to make of her words. "What do you mean, they want something?" Emily didn't answer. She just backed away, her legs refusing to carry her fast enough. The dolls, even though they hadn't moved, still seemed to be watching her. Their eyes, those cold, glassy eyes, followed her every movement, as if they were waiting for her to make the next move. "I don't care," Emily whispered to herself. "I don't care what they want. I'm getting rid of them." Without another word, she turned and fled down the stairs, her footsteps pounding in the hallway. Daniel followed, but she didn't stop. She didn't look back. She didn't care if he followed her, or if he understood. She needed to end it. Now, that night Emily sat in the kitchen, a strange determination settling in her chest. The dolls had to go. She didn't care how. She didn't care where. They couldn't stay in the house. They couldn't stay in her life. Her mind was made up. She grabbed the matches from the drawer, her hands trembling as she lit one. The flame flickered in the darkness, casting a soft glow on the floor. With steady hands, she walked into the living room, where the dolls still sat in their places, silent and still. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She walked into the backyard, the cold air biting at her skin. The fire pit was still there, unused for years. It was just a circle of stones, dark and cold. But tonight, it would be different. Tonight, the dolls would burn. She placed the first one in the center of the fire pit, watching it settle into the earth. The doll, its cracked porcelain face staring up at her, seemed to be waiting. Emily didn't hesitate. She dropped the match and the flame caught. The doll burned quickly, the heat rising in an instant. The fire crackled and popped, the flames licking at the air as the doll turned to ash. But then, something strange happened. The fire didn't die down. It grew, the flames licking higher and higher, casting flickering shadows on the ground. The dolls, those same dolls she had placed in the fire, began to burn faster, as if they were alive, as if they were feeding on the flames, their bodies consumed by the heat. And as they burned, Emily heard it, the sound, a faint whisper, low at first, then louder, a chorus of voices murmuring in unison. "We are free." Emily's heart skipped a beat as she stepped back from the fire. The flames surged higher, casting a blinding light around her. The dolls, those lifeless dolls, were burning. But the voices, they didn't stop. They grew louder. "We are free." Emily watched in disbelief as the fire consumed the last of the dolls. The flames grew higher, and for a moment, she could see shadows moving within them, shapes that danced and twisted just beyond her reach. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was over. The fire died down, the smoke rising into the night sky, and when the last of the flames flickered out, all that remained was ash. The dolls were gone. The house felt different. The air was lighter. The weight, the presence that had hung over her for so long, was gone. Emily stood there for a long time, staring at the empty fire pit, her breath slowly coming back to her. It was over. She didn't know what had happened, what she had just experienced. She didn't know where the dolls had come from, or why they had tormented her. But one thing was certain. They were gone, and she was free.